Uh, so, um, so for me, it came in a little bit of everything. So I did a lot of practice. I go to life drawing. Um, it's a virtual life drawing right now because of COVID, but I take advantage of those kinds of things to practice. Some of it is looking at other people's work in terms of like how they do things. So watching YouTube videos on how other people do it and see how I can apply to my work. Each piece I try to do a little bit better than the last time because I see the work that I do and it's like, okay, I can do better this next time, and this is how I can do it. Because while I'm in the middle of it, I could be fairly happy with it, but in a week I would not be happy. So it's just this constantly trying to improve myself and really analyzing how I can improve myself. And one of the really strange things that helped me was I started picking up mangas and Korean comics. In terms of it for some reason helped me figure out how other artists handle anatomy and such. So it was an odd thing to find improvement with, but I picked it up because COVID, staying indoors and stuff, and it just wound up helping with my artwork as well. So did I answer that okay?
No, yeah, for sure. I think that, yeah, it's kind of, I mean, sometimes, some ways it's hard to respond about your own work and your own process. And I think that some folks who are, you know, successful, I think you have a firm grasp on what that is. And I think it's a tough question to ask too. Like I was doing, or I'm doing actually an interview this afternoon. And one of the questions for the interview is, it's one of these impossible questions. Let me see if I can pull it up. It's like a tough question to ask. Do you have any, or wait, where is it? For those who don't attend an art school, what would you say is the most important thing for them to focus on? It's like such an open-ended question. It's very difficult to answer that question because you could think of, you know, somebody who's sculpture versus somebody who's an illustrator. You would have different pieces of advice, I think, for those particular creatives. Yeah.
I think that with that one, it's more of a general mindset of self-discipline.
Mm-hmm. And for some people, they don't know what that looks like, right? Or maybe it slips away from them. And that's, I think, part of the advice that I give folks is to be not just self-reliant, but self-aware before you start to point fingers at people for not providing you with the things that you think you need. So yeah, I think that, you know, being self-aware, having discipline, and not just saying that you're disciplined, but identifying what that means. You know, what does being a disciplined person actually mean? How much are you actually dedicating yourself to your craft every day? You know, so yeah, I think you answered that question really well. It's just, I think it's just difficult when you're trying to look at yourself and push it out to other people and convey that message to other people. It's a difficult thing for me. You know, sometimes I think based on like laziness or just my mood from the day, my answer to that question varies. You know, like if I'm really tired, it's just like practice. You know, somebody asks me a question like, you just practice, you sit down and you practice. And I think that's a good thing, right? But it's also like, what does that practice mean? What does it mean to make relevant practice? You know, I think that when it comes to what you do, it's based on a variety of tiny things. You know, like you could think about like, well, why is this armor not working? And then what is that research that you do? Do you step away from the piece? Do you go to your sketchbook? Do you look up pictures of armor? If you are looking up pictures of armor or drawing other drawings of armor, what are you looking at? Are you looking at the old school stuff, the new school stuff, a mix of the two?
Yeah, I look at a ton of things actually, because I find that different problems need different solutions. And so sometimes what happens is that so for this piece specifically, I wanted to do Necromancer. This is from a thumbnail I did a while ago while I was still in school. But the idea was that I wanted to do some irregular characters in fantasy. So you have witch doctors and stuff, but you don't have a necromancer who is African American or of African descent. And so I wanted to see what that would look like, because I feel like that could break some of the norms as well that are in fantasy. So that's kind of what I wanted to do with this piece. But that being said, there's not much reference also if I'm looking, if you Google African necromancer, you get witch doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a question of, okay, how do I take the witch doctor out of the equation and try and make it more of a necromancer, and what's the differences, and how do I still celebrate some of the beauties that are associated with like hairstyles and facial features and such. So
Sort of like modernizing it, but also paying attention to the history of it. And,
yes.
Yeah, so then that's a classic issue, and it doesn't happen to me very often, because I think that typically I'm tasked to render someone who exists currently or recently existed. There was only the one time when I worked with the Boston Globe where I had to draw Denis Diderot, who was the partially blind Frenchman who wrote and composed the encyclopedia. And all I could find of him was just sculptures of him and paintings of him, or just really low res imagery of him. So when it came to the fact that you were not finding that reference that you needed, and you started asking yourself those questions, where did you go from there, like practically with your hands, to try to create the Necromancer?
So for this one, I decided to go back into history a little bit. So going back into where you had peoples coming up from North Africa into like Spain and Portugal, back in the medieval eras and such, and looking at some of the stylings from there. I'm also still looking at, as you can see, I'm still looking at some random things. So this one's specific. As you can see, the reference I have here is just for the fabric, because I loved how the folds were.
Yeah.
I also looked at some different stylings from different areas. I had looked at Haitian stylings, but I decided that that was not the way I want to go, because it was too much in terms of the witch doctor kind of feel. So I wanted to back away from that and go with more of the European, North African of the medieval era in that. So, but still bringing in that fantasy and bringing in the armor that doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
But it looks pretty.
Literally everything that Ober just said, it just sounds like I'm talking to a fantasy-oriented illustrator. Like, and I think that what Jen said at the beginning here is that you kind of have to be a nerd. Well, this is it, right? Like, I mean, you're seeing this. You're kind of a dork about history. You're kind of a dork about just the fantastical, but you're also a dork about foundations, right? So that was something I wanted to ask you about. What was your foundations experience in undergrad and in grad, and how much of it was you sort of meeting the instructor halfway when it came to that?
Yeah, so when I was in my undergraduate, so in my undergraduate I did switch schools because I started out at a local university, but my state doesn't have an accredited art school with both accreditations, so I did have to move elsewhere for it. I started out as a fine art major, am focusing on painting. I have a background in that. I've been painting since I was 8 years old. I've been painting for a very long time. But my interests have changed. You can see it in my paintings as well. But when I switched schools and went to REMCAT,
You went to REMCAT. I keep forgetting that. You've told me that like many times, and I forget every time.
Yeah. For the class, I was a tutor as well at the art school, and though we never met, I did have students from Tony's class come to my tutoring because he was an online teacher.
I wasn't doing a very good job.
they had some odd online assignments.
Yeah, it was very strange. I mean, the way that I taught there, I thought it was going to be a lot more integrated and more hands-on, but it was really just, I mean, the adjuncts there, all they had to do was just review the work and then assign a grade. We didn't get to come up with the assignments. We didn't get to come up with the projects. So it was very disconnected, especially for a studio course. It wasn't a lecture course, so it was very difficult to sort of provide them with anything that I thought I could provide them.
Yeah.
So you say you've been painting since you were 8. Were you doing that traditionally? And if so, when was your transition into digital media?
My transition was at RenCat. And so about, I'd say the last year, we were finally introduced into digital work. And so originally I had learned Photoshop briefly in a course at a local art school, but it was not accredited. Very, very basic stuff. So what I usually did with Photoshop was I took good photographs of my paintings and I cleaned them up. I use them actually as Photoshop, and then it would be ready for print. But when I went to RenCat and we had a class, we were introduced into Photoshop at a very quick speed. I don't know what your guys' class schedule is there, but we had 8 weeks for a single course, and you had the same amount of work. So if you're 16 weeks, think of squishing all the work from 16 weeks into 8 weeks.
That's tough.
So, but I learned a lot. I grew a lot with it, and I started to enjoy it. And then when I got to SCAD is when I really started doing majority with digital because of the speed. Oil painters, I know a lot of ways to trick it to be able to get it done faster, but drying time is drying time. You need an entire day for it to set and it's due tomorrow. That's not useful in the long run, especially with the turnarounds nowadays.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. I mean, yeah, that's typically my response. It just doesn't, and it's not like I'm anti-traditional media, or analog media, as Goni would call it. But it's not practical for my situation. Maybe a children's book project that lasts like a year or 2 or something like that. But otherwise, it's just like it inhibits the workflow, at least for me. So speaking of digital media, I think, talk to this crowd about brushes. I think that the brush question always comes up. What folks are typically like, what brushes are you using? As if that's going to help them in any way. I'd like for you to sort of instead walk us through your journey with brushes in the digital space. Like, what brushes did you start out with? Did you or do you ever make your own brushes? Walk us through the interface of Photoshop a little bit when it comes to brushes.
Yeah, so I have a mixture. So when I was first learning, my professor was like, okay, I put together a bundle of brushes that you can use that were free to use, and this is so that way you're not trying to fiddle with brushes but just learning how the program works. So we still got to play with some brushes, but we didn't have to go search. So it was a really great start for me because I had a few brushes that I really didn't understand what I would need, and so it kind of gave me a variety to play with. Nowadays, Photoshop, I don't know if you guys have Photoshop with your classes, if it's comes with the course.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. It comes with the Kyle brushes.
Yep.
So those are a decent one to start with. I still use some Kyle brushes, but as my work has changed and morphed, I get more specific and picky about my brushes. So I got Kyle brushes before it became integrated with Photoshop. So if you look at my brushes here, these are all my Kyle brushes here. And even with all of these, I use 5, maybe.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I use the pencil. I use the there's a one that I really like, which is a palette knife, which makes it actually look like an oil painting for me, which is very helpful for me because I like that kind of look in certain situations, especially with rocks. But I typically only use them. I use probably 2 of these for actual like build up, and then maybe like 3 of them for additional textures. So I really don't use too much of the Kyle brushes anymore, but each person's different. So if you're wanting to do that, you probably should go download and play with some of them. And then here, I've just been collecting. All of these are from different situations where I need a very specific tool. And so some of them I still go back to, like I have some cloud brushes that are some of my favorites to get the clouds going with. And let's see here, what do I got here? I like to use stamp brushes for foliage to start and then paint over the stamps. But it gives me a basis to make it look more natural. I do make my own brushes as well, especially for hair, because they're probably the easiest thing to make in terms of brushes. Have you gone over how to make brushes?
We have not this semester. So go for it. Have at it.
Okay. So typically, I'm gonna make a new file. I'm just gonna make a square. I don't know why it always puts my resolution so low. It always starts out such a weird resolution. Okay, so usually for a hairbrush, I'm sorry to anybody who grew up with VeggieTales.
No, this is great, Jen. I think that this is something that that students want showed to them pretty often. So I think it's good that you're doing this. So
okay. So usually what I do for a hairbrush, and it'll vary depending on what I need. Sometimes I need it to where I need it to be very volumetric, so I usually build it up and then I just need a few little strands. Sometimes it's supposed to be really flowy, so I need a clump to go. So for this one, I'm just gonna make a brush that's more for the final details. So I've made the board and I've opened up a new layer, so that way it's off of the background. I'm going to make sure it's completely black from the black and white over on the side. Can you see okay?
Yep.
Okay. Some of my stuff is popping up on my second screen, so I want to make sure that things can still be seen here. So I make a mess. So what I'm going to do here is, for this brush, I want to make sure that all the lines of the brush are going to be very opaque, because I want to make sure that you can really see the color if I put it down. So what I usually do is I go through and I just randomly put in just circles. It's the regular hard circle brush, super easy. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to, let's see if I can remember, it's been a little bit since I made a brush. Where's my brush presets? And this is what happens when you don't plan in advance. Do some planning. All right, so let's see here. Okay, here we go. So define brush presets. It's going to then make a brush. So now you can see all the dots I've made here. So it's now a brush. I'm just going to name it hairbrush. And I've got a brush. I've got a number of brushes, so I'm going to put it at 6 because I don't want to get them mixed up. And hit OK. And so now my brush is now those dots. Well, that doesn't quite look like hair.
Yeah.
Getting there, but it's not hair. Oops. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to here. And this is where I can start messing with the brush to edit it a little bit. So here, they usually automatically set the spacing to 10%. I'm going to put it all the way down because I want a nice smooth line.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that happens. It's like a default setting too, where the spacing of the brush is either typically at 5 or 10. I always have to pull it straight down before I start working.
Yeah. And so as you can see, that's looking more like hair, but it's not quite there yet. I want to make it a little bit better. I want it to where when it goes and when I'm done, when I come to the end, it's going to taper off just like hair does. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start messing here with some of the brush settings. So no, I don't want to do a brush. So transfer can help with that. And so what I'm doing is I'm just playing here and there and seeing how it's gonna look. I want sometimes it makes a mess if you're doing weird things. So let's see.
There's a lot in here I haven't played around with that you're just adjusting yourself, which is really cool.
Yeah, so a lot of this is just gonna have to play back and forth a little bit. I'm looking for my pressure. So I'm looking for the pressure from here.
There's that little icon at the top in the menu bar there that has like a pen inside of a target. I think that normally, at least when I'm working with a tablet, helps me with pressure sensitivity.
On which one?
If you look at the menu bar, like if you just leave brush settings, you go to your menu bar where you have your opacity.
Oh, here.
Like off to the right, there's that little pen with the target icon. It's next to that butterfly icon.
Oh dear.
And normally when I tick that on, it gives me a solid pressure sensitivity.
Let's see here. And if you get really messed up as well, what you can do is your brush isn't saved yet, so you can go back and reset. So that's one thing. Let's see here. Bring that down. Anyway, so you play with it and you can get different. Oh, I don't know.
Ooh, that's nice. In the preview section.
Yeah, so this is how much you want it to be. There you go.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
There you go. So it's starting to get there.
And I'm sure that if anybody tries this, they could spend much more time than you're spending right now.
Oh yeah, because this is barely. And once you're done with your brush, you have to create a new brush. So you just click here, and it saves a new brush. And you put the new names. There you go. And then if I wanted to, I could then go over to a different file. The brush is still there. It saves into your Photoshop program, not to the file, so you can use it elsewhere.
Very cool. And when you, and so, okay, so when you save your brushes, do you have them organized in a folder on your desktop, or?
I usually save them in here, and then you can export them if you'd like. So if you wanted to export, so say you wanted to switch computers.
Yeah, that's typically a question I get asked.
So what you do is that you would select the brushes that you'd want, say these, and then you say export selected from this little button up here. Hit export selected brushes. You can name the grouping, and then and put it where you want. So I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to put I can't spell today either. It's just one of those days. And so I've saved it off. And so what would happen is now, if I go to my desktop, which is where I saved it, there it is. Let's see here. I need to switch screens. So you can still see okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Switch screens. Okay. So over here is that random brushes that I made.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you do is then you take that file, you put it on a thumb drive, and you can take and plug it into whatever computer. When you plug it in, put it onto the documents or the desktop, preferably documents, because sometimes desktops can be weird.
Yeah.
And when you have your Photoshop open and you click on this, the brushes will populate into your Photoshop file. And if they don't for some reason and they're being fussy, what you can do is switch back screens. There you go. Okay. What you can do is you come over here to your brushes again, and you hit that little icon. You can import brushes, and if I do that, and I go to the desktop, there's my brushes.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's being fussy and it doesn't like the double click, then just go into import and you can get them in.
And I'm assuming you can also upload these to like a cloud or a drive or something like that as well.
Yeah, they work like any other files. So if you need to store them, I sometimes keep an emergency bundle on my Google Drive. Or when I was in school, I had an emergency bundle of like, I forgot my thumb drive. It's there.
Mm-hmm. So this is good. This is great news. So we now know how to do that, or whoever didn't know how to do that knows how to do that. Let's go ahead and bring up your demo, and let's get started on that. Let's see what the process looks like. Does anybody have any questions at all while Ober's bringing up the demo? Anything about making brushes or anything that we've talked about at all? No pressure? Okay.
For your professional pieces, how long on average do you spend on those? Or is that entirely dependent on the project?
It's dependent on the project, it's dependent on the price.
Gotcha.
So I could, a lot of time, because I'm working with personal clients, it's also dependent on, okay, what is their budget? So we can still work with them, but it's not going to be like my portfolio piece. That can sometimes happen. I still try to do a good job so that they're happy with the piece, but I try not to do too much extra time, because it's not worth my time.
I'm so happy that you said it depends on their budget. I think that's super important. You know, that directs me to a question that I get asked a lot, which is, how do I price my work? You know, and I always revert it back to, who is it you're working for and what kind of budget do they have? Because that is what the price is. Most times, right? Like, I think sometimes corporate mags can try to swindle illustrators and get them to do work that should be either $750 to $3,000 for just like $200. And I used to take those gigs because I needed them at the time that they were offered. But the most important thing you can do is just flip it back onto a client and ask them what their budget is. And that lesson truly came to fruition when for a very brief time, transitioned into advertising illustration to do that 1 gig for Facebook TV. And you know, the industry standard for editorial is anywhere between $750 to $3,000 for interiors, not including covers. And so knowing that, and knowing that I would execute my best within that price range, instead of telling Facebook TV what I would charge, which I would have told them that if I had told them anything, I instead asked them what their budget was. And their budget was so much higher than I, you know, so it's really, you'd be doing yourself a disservice to try to, you know, say things. And I see some people on Instagram saying things like, I do faces for 20, I do full body for 30, and, you know, just research your industry, like the subgenre of your industry, you know, like the subgenre, the avenue of the illustration industry that I work with is editorial. Become familiar with the industry standard is, because there is one. So I think it's great that you mentioned that, Jennifer, about, you know, asking the client what the budget is.
And if you are not sure where to start, there's the Graphic Design Guild's handbook, which sometimes I take on odd jobs because I'm still in that phase of odd jobs until I can do everything that I want to do. So sometimes I don't know how much to charge for a vector stamp because it's not usually my thing.
Bye, class. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Sorry, we're changing classes, so there's people leaving and people coming. But yeah, you guys keep doing your thing.
So we'll go to that booklet and it'll give me a price range, and it gets into specifics of like, okay, if you're freelance, if you're working with a job, this is how much salary should be. If you're freelance, this is how much it should be, how much the costs of things will be, what the client is responsible for, that kind of thing. It'll go into some of those details, and also it'll sometimes also go into the laws associated with it as well, because work for hire is technically against the law. And there's only a few certain circumstances where work for hire is permitted. But if you're doing work for hire and all your rights are going away to client or dirt cheap, that's against the law. So you do put your foot down.
Or you take them, right?
Or you take them because if they're paying for it, they're paying for it. But if they're taking for dirt cheap, that's something else.
Yeah, you know, I was definitely advised to never do work for hire when I was in school. Mm-hmm. And I very quickly realized that I had to do a lot of them in order to survive at the beginning, right?
And some of it is that, especially if it's something for the smaller company or something, you can still say like, okay, majority of the rights are yours, but I still want to retain rights to portfolio and my own prints.
Yeah.
So sometimes you can work middle point.
It also depends too on who you're working for, you know. Like, I think that, you know, there are a lot of horror stories when it comes to work for hire, where the creator should have received so much more and should have received royalties, and it's just a shame. Like, I used the James Earl Jones voicing Darth Vader as an example. Like, he did the Darth Vader voices as work for hire. So James Earl Jones does not receive royalties for Star Wars. Like, he didn't even know that it was going to become Star Wars, you know? And same thing with I forget the designer who created the Nike swoosh. She did that as a work for hire. And so, yeah, you kind of have to use your better judgment, you know, like, are you creating a logo for your friend who has a startup company, you know, and it looks as though it's promising, you know? Like, I would take into account whether or not, you know, you may want to collect royalties on something like that and have rights to your image, your imagery in the future. It's a sticky thing. It's kind of like under the table. It's shady. It's definitely shady, as Ober mentioned. But it's one of those things where, like, you don't realize the true lesson of it until you're in the mix of it. You know, like I remember that moment where I was like, whoa, I'm about to do a work for hire. All my professors are going to hate me, you know, but you kind of have to like roll with the punches and do what you need to do. So let's get this demo up.
All right.
This is exciting.
So should I show the video again since we have new people?
Let's go ahead. We can show them. We can show the time lapse towards the end. Let's just start painting.
All right, sounds good. So, for those who saw it before, this one's and those who are just coming in, I'm currently working on, this is a personal piece for a necromancer. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to have somebody who was of African descent and was not a witch doctor. So necromancer and witch doctor in games are typically different. And so therefore I did want to have somebody specifically being a necromancer. This is from a sketch I did in my back when I was in SCAD when I was with Tony. This is probably like a year after the class was in the middle of my time there. So what I've done is that I've built it up, putting in all the colors, and I've already decided the color palette and everything. And so now what I want to do is I'm currently at render phase. So this is the time when I have to just buckle down, put on some music, because I know what I'm going to do, but it's going to take a while. So I've been tackling the main figure, because now that I've gotten a basic for the background and such, I want to see how far I can push the figure, because that's going to want to be my center point. So I'm going to now push the figure as much as I can personally do and then I will finish up wrapping up the rest of the figures, so that way it still matches well, because I can, when it comes to still lifes and stuff, I can get very detailed really easily, but figures take me a little bit more effort. So that's why I want to make sure, since she is the focal point, that we are really focusing on her. So
let me ask you this. This is really interesting. When I was looking at this piece, I thought it was done, right? And I think that maybe some other folks may think the same thing. And maybe at some point in your past, you would have thought this piece was done as well, right? So can you explain what goes on in your mind as you've evolved and made those decisions in your mind when it comes to finished pieces? Is it something that is internal, or is it something that's external, in that you constantly have this standard in your mind based on the other images that you're inspired by and their level of finish? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, because I need to give myself a little bit of grace, or else I'll get overwhelmed.
Yeah. Right.
So I need to give myself a little bit of grace in terms of that I want this piece to be better than what I've done.
Yeah, okay.
I may not be able to get to the level of everybody else, that's my goal. But this one, I'm going to try to make it better than the last piece.
Tiny goals and then the big goals. You keep them all.
Yes, so give yourself credit, because if it's better than your previous piece, you've made progress. If you're not quite there yet, you're not, in terms of like where you want to be, you're not quite there yet. So you just keep practicing and continuing to make work.
And be patient, right? Yeah, I think that's such great advice, because I think that some students are looking for either me or for them to be able to figure out exactly the day and time when they've reached the point that they'd like to be. And I think that's such a baseless dream, you know, to think to yourself like, okay, on January 21st, I'm going to reach the pinnacle of my skill level. Or when will I be ready to be a concept artist? You know, like, it's one of those things that's hard to explain, because it's not something you can touch. It's not something that you attain. It's something that you practice every day. You know, it's not you're going to reach a point where you now are the master of whatever it is. It's just like you said, like tiny goal after tiny goal. And I was telling my students this the other day, like I am at the beginning of the the pandemic, I started watching a lot of Bob Ross, and it was just to calm my nerves, right? Like it was really stressful, and and after watching a ton of Bob Ross, I thought to myself, like, maybe I could do a Bob Ross piece, you know, like maybe I could do a Bob Ross inspired landscape. And at first I had the aspiration of doing it traditionally, but then I was just like, you know what, I have this iPad here, I never use it. Let me open up Procreate, let me try and do a Bob Ross landscape. But it wasn't necessarily me thinking to myself, let me try a Bob Ross landscape. It was, can I do a Bob Ross sky, right? It was just this really specific goal. Can I do the sky? And it's almost like one of those goals that's like almost too easy to meet, you know? Like people forget that waking up in the morning and making a cup of coffee, that's a goal, right? You have the goal in mind, even though it's very small. Some may not consider it like an actual goal because we typically think of things that are much harder as goals, you know, that are reached. But small things like that, they build up your self-esteem, they build up your confidence, and they don't overwhelm you, right? Like having a huge goal is overwhelming. It's like, and sometimes it turns people off of their initial dream because it's so big, it's overwhelming. So I think this idea that you're putting forth about having small goals is a really great way to think about things and not overwhelm yourself, you know? Like it was slowly but surely for me with the landscapes. It was like, can I do a sky? And then within a few hours I was getting that down. And then the next day while my son was napping, it was like, can I do the mountains? Can I figure out how to do these mountains? And then within just a few days I was doing a Bob Ross landscape, right? Because of just meeting all those tiny little goals. So I think that's a really, really great point that you put forth.
And so and this is also where being a nerd in whatever you want to do is going to be important, because you're going to have to do it repeatedly. So you've got to enjoy it. And that's when you make your best work, is when you enjoy it. So this kind of like practice of like making little small steps, it takes time. And so you want to make sure that the time that you're investing, you're enjoying it. So that's why you're here.
Yeah.
So
that's a great point too.
And so when I, because I'm a nerd in terms of like history and stuff, I really enjoy doing the research and stuff for these kinds of pieces. It's the thing that gets me excited about getting these pieces going, and that's where I get started. That's where I get my fuel. For each person, it's different. For some people, it's a passion about certain like events or things happening in the world around them that they are particularly passionate about, that gets them like, this is what I want to talk about, this is what I want to draw. So whatever it is for you, if you enjoy doing it, there are people who will pay for it. I mean, if you enjoy it, you should go after that.
I agree. And again, just to let everybody know, the floor is open for questions. Like if you want to chime in, ask anything, it's completely open. This is just a dialogue that's happening while Ober's getting into the zone. I know it's really hard to talk and paint at the same time. Trust me, I do it quite often in class. So I mean, just feel free to get lost in what you're doing, Jen. And I think that we'll be able to take a lot from just watching. But if anybody has any questions, go ahead and chime in at any time, no pressure. Yeah.
So I'm a traditionalist, and I want to learn Photoshop without taking courses. Like, where do you begin?
So the question is, where do you begin learning digital media, learning how to paint digitally without actually taking a course? I'll let Jen answer that first, and then I'll chime in as well.
That's a little bit difficult because I did take a course for it, even though it was very, very basic. But after the course, I did delve into it on my own, playing around with the stuff. But I did learn the generals from a course. However, nowadays online, like on YouTube, learning the very, very basics. There's a lot of basic, like how to start learning in Photoshop. Just so that you can get more familiar with where the brushes are and how the layering system works, just getting a basic how the program works. Even just going onto like YouTube, just figuring out the basics in that sense, and then fiddling on your own as well. I mean, it's a lot. When I was first starting out, it was a lot of just playing with the program, figuring out how it worked, why it worked, why didn't it not work.
Yeah, I think that, you know, when it comes to digital media, or when it comes to any task, really, I mean, I agree with Jen, but if you look at what Jen's doing right now, that is, I would say, with the layers that she has, the brushes she has, the overall level of finish that she has with this piece, you're looking at, and unless anybody wants to disagree with me, maybe 2%. You know, she's using maybe 2% of what Photoshop provides.
Yeah.
So I think that, and I think that's the case with a lot of artists who work within this program specifically. It could feel really overwhelming when you get into that program and you look at all these things that it offers. But just to, you know, create some layers in your layers palette, using maybe 2 tools on the toolbar there, the brush, the eraser, maybe the clone stamp tool, and then changing the opacity or the pressure sensitivity of that, you're using very little of the program. So I think that at first it's weird. It's kind of similar to, like, I don't know if any of you ever took computer classes where you start to learn how to type, like learn how to type on the keyboard. It's like weird. At first you're not comfortable with it, but then after like practicing on that keyboard, you're just flying, you know, like you're able to type however many words per minute. I think that's similar with Photoshop. You know, it's very different than taking your brush and dipping it into the, you know, linseed oil and then mixing the paint on the palette. It's not the same. And that's something that as a traditionalist, you've probably been doing for a long time. So that's ingrained in your mind on how you do that. But with Photoshop, especially when you change your key commands, and that's one of the reasons why I look like I don't know how to use Photoshop when I use these school computers, because I've changed my key commands on my computer. So like, for example, the eyedropper tool on my computer is the letter Y, and the brush tool is the letter U. Whereas I think on standard Photoshop, the key commands are I for eyedropper tool and B for brush, you know? But yeah. I found that my workflow is much quicker by having the keys closer together. So that's a preference that I changed in Photoshop, and it speeds up my process so much. So whatever you end up customizing the program to do in terms of key commands and where you want things, like, for example, like I don't even work with the color or the gradients or the swatches in my workflow. I just like take them out. I like declutter the space completely because it works for me that way. So once you have that, like that pattern of like, okay, this is how I open up a file, this is how I create a layer, this is the brush I'm going to use, it becomes very intuitive. So I think that transitioning from a traditional style of working to a digital style of working is really just uncovering the tools that you wanna mess with, and which are very self-explanatory. They're just these little icons, and the brush is the icon, the eraser is the eraser icon, and then time. So that plus time. For me, when I started working in digital media, I didn't know any of it at all, but I went into it with this idea of I really like Joe Ciardiello and I really like Patrick Morgan, 2 illustrators. I like Joe Ciardiello's line, which is a very thin line. It's like a rapidograph pen. And I like Patrick Morgan's flat color thing. So my whole thing was, how can I merge those 2 together? I didn't want to mix color in Photoshop because it's terrifying. Like what Ober's doing right now, I would have never done that. I know how to do it now. When I started, I would have never attempted it because it was terrifying to me. So I just settled on this flat color next to flat color look, which ended up defining how I work today. Really basic, way of drawing in Photoshop. But I think that in not to draw out the the answer too long. I think that would be the answer, at least from me, and I guess Jen as well.
When you do it, you do like everything. How do you decide layers?
So we have a layers question. Like, how do you decide what value or what color or what hue rather sits on which layers and why? That's a good question.
Okay.
It's different for everybody. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yes. So for this one, what I usually do is I do a group.
Yeah, walk us through your layers.
Okay. So each person's different, but how I usually do mine is, zoom out here.
Ober, can you do me a favor and take the color gradients and swatches out so we can see more of the layers? There we go.
Okay, can you see okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I usually I do groups and then there's messes in the group. So usually what happens is that because of my traditional background, I sometimes forgo how the layers are within the group. So say I know I want my Necromancer to be on its own layer. I want it to be all by itself. You can see this is the underdrawing here. I want it to be on its own layer so I can move it and adjust it as I need to. So I keep it in its own layer, but if you look at my layers here, we've got some armor here, but it's also here as well.
And do you do that? Do you switch between, because that's one of the things I do, is that when I have something looking the way I want it to look and I don't want to risk it anymore, I just create a new layer.
I'll do that as well. So say I like how this is going, and this again goes back to my traditional, because usually if you're doing detail, you start with the big, you go smaller, 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 but as you're going, there's a certain point where the medium gets too wet, so you have to let it dry. So me saying for this here, I had, where's that layer? So I had this here. I knew that shape I wanted, but I needed to go more detailed. So I went ahead and added a new layer in. And then here, I had decided that I liked the look, but I needed to do a little bit of an adjustment on the color here. So I did that also on a separate layer to try it out, because if I didn't like it, I want to be able to easily get rid of it. So having a ton of layers to begin, like as you're working, is fine. You just have to make sure it doesn't bog down too much of your computer. Eventually collapse stuff when you can, and if you can separate things, if you need things to be separated because the client needs things to be separated, so like, oh, I need to animate something in between, then you need to make sure you can do clear layers that way as well.
Yeah.
So as you can see, like I'm sorry?
No, I was asking the student if it answered their question, and it did.
Yeah, and so like here, I've got my army on its own layer, like on its own group, and then I have all the different army individuals.
Do you ever experiment with layer styles at all?
Yes. So I typically, what I'll do is, that's towards the end. So I'll use like, to be able to do slight adjustments, I'll use like the multiply and overlay, which are here. So if say, let's see here. My computer's running a little bit slower because of doing both the Skype and this. But say with this front layer here with the bush, I wanted to go a little bit darker, or I wanted to change it to more of a blue. I'm gonna go ahead and for me, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to then right click, and then I'm going to create a clipping mask. And that means that for this layer will only show what is visible on this layer. So all of my bush is on this layer, and so everything that's been painted on the bush layer will also be able to be painted on the next layer. So I'm just going to go ahead and take a blue. Let's take a demonstration. Don't cry, Ellen. Don't cry. Don't cry. Will you work? So there you go.
Yeah, there it is.
There you go.
So easy. What a great, effective solution.
And so, okay, yes, it's blue now, but it's not the right blue, and I've lost some of the color variation that I had originally. So to fix that, and besides, I wanted to make it also like a little bit darker. I'm gonna go in here and play with that. So here's it previews what is gonna happen. So there's a darken, there's multiply. This will look lightened, screen. I'm gonna actually go down probably to overlay. And you can see that it changes the colors a bit and also the value a little bit. But I'll also adjust the opacity as needed, and I'll adjust it from there. So when I get towards the end, also with the figure, I'll also go in with this kind of technique. This is also why I keep the items separate, so that way I can clipping mask the group, because you can clipping mask the entire group, and then be able to do that kind of mask to adjust the shadows, to adjust the highlights. So like to say for the Necromancer, I wanted to do the same kind of thing, but because I want to have this area here be more dramatic. So because of the clipping mask, it only shows where those layers are. And then I'm gonna go ahead and hit multiply because I want it darker, but I'm also gonna adjust it down. And sometimes it's only like a 10%, 20%, it depends on the amount. But
yeah, sometimes for me, it's when I do things like this, I'll find myself messing with it even at like 2 or 3%.
What was that one that you did that they needed like a 2% difference?
Oh, where the art director had me adjust it. No, that's another story. Yeah, an art director had me. This is the kind of thing that I don't like when it comes to working with art directors, is that oftentimes, I think working with an art director where they're a good art director, their phraseology is typically like, for example, could you make Kurt Cobain look more vulnerable? Like I think that's a good piece of feedback. But sometimes you work with art directors where it almost kind of feels like you're designing a flyer for like your mom, and she's like over your shoulder, and she's like, could you move it a little bit to the left, or could you just move it 2 ticks to the right? And you just end up sending all this stuff, and then they send you emails back like, could you adjust the opacity by 5%? And then you do it, and then you send it to them, again, and you end up going down this rabbit hole of, where does this end? And it could be really frustrating. And I think that in moments like that, I think it's important to bring that up, because you need to stand your ground as a professional. But you don't want to come off rude, but you don't want to get walked all over, There's only been 2 cases in my career where I just refused to work with a specific client, because of that and because of other things. So it's not something that happens often. I feel like folks who are typically in the position of art director have earned that position, and they're good at what they do, and they know what they need to do. And but every now and then it gets, that's a way that an art director could take advantage of an illustrator, because those kinds of things, those are not the sign of a person who knows what they want, right? It's the sign of somebody who's just micromanaging just a little bit too much, and it just creates an unhealthy, I think, collaboration between the illustrator and the art director. But no, yeah, that happened to me, where I was literally asked to adjust the opacity of an item by 2%. Which, for those of you who don't know, it's almost completely, you can't see that, you know, unless, and the reason I say I do that from time to time, unless you're working with a really bright, you know, composition. Like right now, Ober's composition is really dark. I actually worked on a piece recently where I had like a rainbow against a white backdrop. So in those situations, a 2% difference could mean something, and to you maybe, but maybe not to anyone else. You know, like I think typically the artist is a lot more critical of what they're doing, and they can see things that other people can't. Like I've submitted things to clients where I've inputted messages, like messages to my friends in the work, and they have no idea. Like actual written messages. And so, you know, they may not catch the things that you're really critical about and observant about. But yeah, no, sometimes a 2% difference makes a big difference, and sometimes when folks ask you to change things, it can be rather annoying or burdensome, and you have to use your utility, like your gut feeling, to know when it's appropriate to stand up for yourself. And I would recommend that in those situations, try not to do it via email. I would try to hop on the phone with an art director. And again, you don't want to burn bridges. As much as you can, handle that. But there are some times where you just have to call it quits with somebody, which is unfortunate.
Tony, do you care if I jump in for a question real quick?
Yeah, go for it, please.
So this is a question for Jennifer, but also Tony, you can answer too. But if somebody, like if you have a client that is commissioning something, or if you're working on your own work, you know, obviously your style is going to shine, and you're probably going to be tasked to create something in your style. But Jennifer, you mentioned working for Bento Box, and I think you said doing backgrounds. Mm-hmm. If you're doing a background for somebody else's work, is it hard to, like, sometimes is it hard to fit in stylistically with their work? Like, are you able to have your own artistic license with that, or do you really have to kind of fit the mold of what somebody else's style is? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're working as a team. So I work as a team with a lot of background designers, and so with the current project, we had like the most, I think we had like 9 backgrounds, which is a lot. But that was at one point. You're all 9 people trying to do the same style. The style has already been decided upon, and so yes, you want to follow the design. There are some times where you have artistic license about like placement and stuff for the composition, but you are trying to fit other people's styles so it's all one cohesive piece. It's not, for me, I've always been a bit of a chameleon in certain things, certain aspects. So for me, I can chameleon into it, even though it's not the type of thing that I normally do. It's very different. And so it's, but it's not a bad thing, because I've also learned a lot, because it is pushing me outside of my box. And I've been able to incorporate it even into this piece here, because it's the work that I do is more line driven, and I don't do line work normally. It's helped me with making the pieces more clear in terms of the composition and how the shape looks overall.
Yeah, I think that anybody who works with those companies has to want to work in a group. You know, like, I mean, I don't know if you saw Colin Geller, or if were around for Colin Geller's talk over, but he works at id Software, and he does like he designed some of the levels for Doom, the game Doom, and I think he did the cover for Doom, and
yeah.
he was the one who mentioned, you have to like to work with a team if you're going to be pursuing these things. So I think to Tucker's question, in addition to what you've said, I think that some of the folks who work at, like, say, Archer, and they work there as background artists, they have to fixate themselves to the look of Archer. And I think that there's, a variety of design directors and lead illustrators there. I think that one of Rick's friends is a lead illustrator there. I forget his name. He's apparently like a ninja as well. And is that ringing any bells, Ober? He's like a certified ninja, like an actual ninja.
Oh, no.
You remember this guy? I forget his name. He like came to us once and he had like a broken arm and he was really cool. I just forget his name. But he's like one of the lead illustrators at Archer. And so he's somebody who would train you in that situation if you weren't a chameleon, like Jen is saying, to be able to fixate your look to the company's desire. And although that is very a good situation for a lot of people, it's something that I've never really aspired to. It's kind of like, being on a late night TV show versus having your own podcast. Is the way I would describe it. Like being on a late night TV show, you have all these rules. Being a freelancer, for you're kind of your own boss, and people come to you for exactly what you want, what you do, and what you can do, and what you're capable of. I also don't like to work in groups, so it's not something that's for me. But it's cool. Like some people, like I don't know if I told you this, Ober, when I was working at SCAD, I almost left SCAD to work at Archer. Because
Really?
it sounded awesome. It's like, it's not like you can't make your own art in addition to working at Archer. There was lots of health benefits and you got like full dental and it was like a 9 to 5 and you got paid, I forget the salary, it was like 65, 70K a year. And you basically would just go into work and they would give you like a room and you would have to make it look like the room exploded or something exploded in the room. And that sounded really appealing for a while until I started to learn a little bit more about, the whole team aspect, which I wasn't excited about, and having to answer to somebody. But for lots of people, that works out really well for them, and they enjoy that and they're thankful for that. And as I said, I was actually considering doing something like that at one point. I love the reflected light you're working on right now.
Yeah, so because of with the rendering, so you have, I'm sure Tony's gone over it. You've got the midtones, the shadows, the lights, the highlights, and the reflected lights. So that's kind of what my rendering is right now. I'm starting, because my reflective light is so strong with this wand. It affects the colors a lot, so it gets put in a little earlier than normal. But yeah, no, and you've got the other thing is that, like, I've been very lucky with my work in that I have a great team that is very supportive and stuff, and that's also very important because we're working 10-hour days. I overtime 60 hours, in a week. So if you like doing backgrounds, if you like doing that kind of thing, then you will enjoy doing this work. So whatever you choose, you're going to be putting a lot of hours into it. So do enjoy it.
Yeah. Another really good question from the room here. How do you deal with copyright issues, Ober? Not necessarily from the perspective of you infringing on someone else, but from the perspective of somebody stealing your work.
I haven't had any major issues with that because I've been very careful. And one way to keep an eye on your work is to Google yourself, or Google your artwork and see where it comes up. You can put notices, like say on social media, in terms of like if you want to share the work, just acknowledge the artist. Usually that kind of thing's not a big deal. If you're having something to where they're actually like using your work to create products and stuff, then you can do a cease and desist. But thankfully I haven't been in that situation yet. And I'm sure everybody who's a professional has been through it at least once, but I haven't had that issue yet.
It is awful. This is a big question that, I've run into issues with copyright, but only when it comes to folks infringing on my work rather than me infringing on theirs. Every time I think of my fish piece that I did for Rolling Stone, I get a bittersweet feeling because it was such a privilege to have done that work and have done that full pager for them. But it was also such a burden, mainly because of how many times it was stolen. And it was very new to me, so this piece did a lot for me financially. I liked the band Fish prior to doing this piece, and I'd been to one show in Atlanta over a decade ago, but it's my wife who was really like the diehard fan of the band, so it was that much cooler to get to do this project. So I finished the piece. It went through a few changes when it came to the size of the musicians. I had a few hands embracing Trey, the main figure with the guitar. And those ideas were kicked to the curb, all very normal changes, right? The piece was done, I was paid, it was just like any other editorial gig. And I thought it was all done. And over the winter break that followed, SCAD's first fall quarter, because we ran on a quarter system there, my wife suggested that I try to sell the image as a limited run of prints. And so she felt that the Fish community would like to have a copy. So the same evening that she recommended this, I put the image in my shop. And Rolling Stone also shared it on their IG, and then my store crashed, and it was crazy. Like, we were on our way to our friend's house, and they all sold out really fast within a few hours, and I had more money in the bank than I'd ever had in my life. And it was really cool because I never received more commentary or emails or feedback or critiques, negative feedback even, on anything I'd ever done, especially on Facebook. Facebook typically tends to be friendly. What's up, Straley? Sorry. We have a new person in attendance. And I'd never received any critical feedback like that, like I had done with this image. And I think 100% it had to do with the fact that it was Rolling Stone, their platform is really big. Also because the Fish community is out of their minds, like collectively as a group. They're crazy people. When I say insane, they're really just like obsessed with art of the band and for the band, and they're obsessed with quality overall. Like, I remember when I went to that show, it was like a 3 or 4 day show, and we got on a bus with these people who had been to the 2 previous shows. We're just ripping the show apart, like critically. And that's when I kind of realized, like, okay, this fan base is a little intense. So after I sold the prints, I started receiving pictures of what people were saying was damaged art, right? And I promise you, none of you would have been able to tell that the work was damaged at all. They'd be pointing to like a non-existent corner of a Giclée that they bought from me, telling me that, it's not mint condition, and that, they need the work to be mint and all that. And so I feel like, a typical fan of like Taylor Swift or like John Mayer, those fans are not like studying the similarities and differences of their live show in like Chicago versus their live show in like New York or somewhere else, right? Fish heads are like deadheads in that they can recall specific guitar solos from specific live events. And, that community can hear a solo and know that it was New Year's Eve in Miami at 3 a.m. in 2008. It's crazy. They're out of control. So it's really kind of funny, you know, but this whole thing sort of taught me a lesson, and that lesson being registering a copyright for your artwork might be a smart idea from time to time, not always. So, as I said, I'm not coming at y'all from the typical perspective of be careful what reference you use because you could be at risk of infringing someone else's photograph. I think that's typically what's discussed when it comes to copyright, you know, as it relates to illustration. I'm actually, as I said, coming at it from the other side, right? The majority of illustrators I know, they don't know how to protect their work. They think that watermarking their work is enough protection from the madness of the internet. It's definitely not the case. And again, I'm not a popular artist by a long shot. So this piece was the only thing that really stung me, you know, since I started out in the industry. So folks stole this piece and they stole it a lot. And I went from totally flattered, right, to concerned for customers to completely furious about copyright. And so before long, you know, this image was being lifted, resold, repurposed, anything you can think of. And this was long after the initial print sale that I put out. So parents were sending me their kids' version of the piece as paintings. And I've been collecting these because I think they're kind of cool, or at least in some cases. And I've actually received multiple copies that kids and adults have done of that piece. And I'm not entirely sure why that piece resonated so much with that community, because there's a lot of fish art out there. And maybe this is just commonplace, right? Like maybe it's not just my piece, and maybe it's not so special, right? That was something I talked about with my wife, you know, like maybe it's normal for them and sort of common practice to beat an image to death. So, you know, as I said, my first reaction was, wow, like I'm so flattered, you know, my art is getting stolen, it's getting remade. Someone even created a limited run of puzzle pieces, like a 10,000 piece puzzle, which is something I think Burns used to do with some of his classes. But then it was like every other day it felt like someone was sending me a sweater or like a shower curtain, and I started to feel less flattered and more concerned for the customers, right? I started receiving emails from people about how their t-shirt didn't fit or that their shower curtain was pixelated. And it's like, well, yeah, you know, like I don't sell t-shirts, you know, you've got the right guy, but you've also got the wrong guy. I made the art, but I'm not whoever is selling it on whatever website you're finding it on, right? So I think, you know, what started as flattery, you know, quickly became, you know, frustration. Because customers were being duped, you know, that they're obviously not getting high quality work, you know, and somebody else is profiting quite a bit. So I stepped in, right? And the responses were baffling. Most of the folks I contacted didn't even think they were doing anything wrong. Some folks on eBay were confused why I wasn't happy that my artwork was getting out there, right? You know, I quickly learned that engaging with these resellers and these thieves was pointless. And I learned that the power of a cease and desist wasn't as powerful as I thought. In a few cases, it was easy for me to get my agent to get the sites themselves to remove the resellers and the art thieves and all that. But it's a lot more labor intensive to do that, especially at the pace that this was all going. So it's really just unmanageable. And so I was actually only even aware of theft when some random person would inform me via email or social media. So my brother-in-law has a gig with the United States Copyright Office, and he educated me on a couple of terms called statutory damages and real damages. So if you're suing under real damages, it turns out to be, as I said, completely unmanageable and completely not worth it. So you as the artist, you would pay the court costs and you'd only really have the chance to take back exactly what was stolen from you. So if your court costs are in the hundreds and the perp only stole like $10 or something worth of your product, you have to ask yourself the question, like, who's really biting the dust on this, right? So it's not worth it for you as the artist, you know, and you would have been, you know, it would have been the only route that I could have taken at the time if I wanted to take action beyond cease and desist letters. So statutory damages are like a speeding ticket. And this, I think, is the better route to take. So in this case, I think as it related to my situation, it theoretically wouldn't matter how much the perp sold. They could have sold 20 bucks of my content, but they'd still have to pay anywhere between $2,500 and $25,000 in statutory damages. And that is current 2021 information. So it's kind of like a parking ticket, right? So if you're a veteran art thief or just starting out, you could face the same monetary or financial punishment, which is something I could totally get behind, right? That's the thing that stings people. Unfortunately, if you don't have legal representation that can put into position, the mechanisms that are needed for identifying, and investigating specific IP addresses, it's really just you versus the site that's stolen the artwork. So the key to pursuing statutory damages is registering your artwork with the United States Copyright Office. And if your illustration is registered, the perpetrator pays the court costs. They have to pay that fee between 25 and 25 grand. And that's regardless of whether or not they sold any of your work. And they may potentially face jail time. So it's a big burn. So I quickly realized that 35 per image, registering all of my imagery wouldn't be the best practice, when it comes to my finances, right? 35 bucks adds up, especially with all the artwork that you make, right? So, and I think this is where I learned the most valuable lesson when it came to art theft and copyright registration. Every artist is different, right? So like James Jean, both James Jean and I are very different, and I would say we're not even close to being in the same category of success in the art world. But there are some artists who have their nets cast, pretty widely in the art world, to the point where they're perceived as celebrity by both, their peers and then the average Joes who aren't really like super connected with the art world. So like even my mom knows who James Jean is, right? And she doesn't know anything about art. So you have to sort of become self-aware about where you sit in the art world and think about the work that you're producing, whether it be client work or personal work. You have to ask yourself, is this image going to be problematic? I shouldn't have brushed off my wife's warning about the fish community because she warned me that they were a crazy group of people, right? I learned recently that there's several customers of mine who only purchased my fish art and they have yet to open their tubes from like 5 years ago. They just had to buy it and have it. They don't even want to look at it. It's so weird. I guess they're just like collectors and they had to have my work just to say that they had a copy. And so in a way, it's not even about whether the art is good to them in a sense. It's more about the exclusivity and the bragging rights about getting, a specific edition number when it comes to a specific edition. But that would have never happened with like a portrait of like Bryan Cranston as Walter White, or maybe it would have, I don't know, or any of the poets that I've portrayed in the New Yorker when the New Yorker comes calling for me. Nobody has ever heard of Terrence Hayes, right? No offense to Terrence Hayes, but so my point is as of now, unless there's a better and more effective way of going about this, and anybody can chime in if they like, using your better judgment on the artwork that you produce and the artwork that you sell, I think is the way to go. You need to make the call. Is this piece going to be problematic? Is this a piece that I should register with the United States Copyright Office? Excuse me. I think it's just the best thing that you can do if you feel that there might be some backlash, right? So that's my take on copyright as it exists and as you would frame it around the artist protecting their own work. And anybody can chime in if they'd like. Did I put everybody to sleep? What's up, Shirley? Yeah, we're zooming right now. Yeah, we got Stewart's Creek in the house. We have John Purier, we have Alexandria Neef, and we have Isabella Contreras, who is a new student of mine. How have you been? Yeah? A lot of work? Oh, you're not in any classes this semester? Oh. Good, yeah. We miss having you in class. Some folks are I don't know if y'all have ever done this before, but I have students right now who say they're taking 5 classes. Are you taking 5?
I did that.
I'm double.
Oh my gosh.
I have 5.
5 studios? So theoretically, like on a Friday, if you wanted to go to like a Baskin Robbins to get an ice cream cone, you wouldn't be able to.
I'm actually starting to watch
Yeah. I hope this is helpful. You have to be really picky with what you're doing. Wow. That's intense. And that makes me think of something else that I think is really important. School is hard, right? I've talked about that quite a bit. School was so much harder. They made it seem like when we were in school that the real world was going to be harder than school. Yeah, I don't think that it is. I mean, and that may be just my opinion. I think that nothing will ever compare to, in terms of difficulty, to how hard it was to establish myself in the industry. That was the hardest thing ever. But being in it is not even close to being as hard as school was. Like, I never have 3 or 4 or 5 projects due on the same day. That never happens. I get all the sleep I need, you know. I think that school is, I think, generally speaking, maybe too hard on their students. And there's this mentality, like I typically I'm like alone in this, I think, in the department. The vibe is that you should be staying up all night, right? I think that there was and correct me if I'm wrong, Ober, SCAD had a joke that their acronym was Sleep Comes After Death.
Yep. It was,
yeah.
Instead of being Savannah College of Art and Design, it was Sleep Comes After Death.
Yeah, and that was perpetuated as like a funny thing. And I'm like on the other side of the fence where it's like, no, that's not funny. Like, you shouldn't be encouraging people to, like, there's this culture around like staying up all night is like a good thing, you know, but to me, it's just a sign of somebody who doesn't have their stuff in order. It's like, you're losing sleep? What are you talking about? This should be an embarrassing thing. You should be looking out for your friends. Like, oh no, you had to stay up all night. But typically, like the vibe is like, it was cool that you're dedicated if you stay up all night. It's really not a good thing. I think that's dangerous. That's why I'm not a fan of those like all night challenges where we're all there in our pajamas, you know, working on a generate and all that stuff. We're doing a challenge here at MTSU, but it's just a 15-hour challenge. I'm sending everybody home after a certain period of time. But yeah, it's strange. Like, I think that school it doesn't necessarily have to be like, let's work the students to death, and that's the best way that they'll get their education.
They're doing stuff.
They need to go. Tell them I said they need to go home and go to sleep. I think it's crazy. Like, I mean, it's not to say that there aren't some times where things pile up and you have to work through burn the midnight oil, as they say. But the frequency at which it occurs is alarming to me. I can't. School was really hard. I remember school being really hard, and I don't think that it has to be so hard for you to learn as much as you end up learning. If you ever feel like you aren't able to keep to your schedule or you're like falling behind, just remember it's not your fault. It's probably not your fault. It's probably the fault of all these intense, you would think that it'd be smart for instructors at a university to have a dialogue with each other about due dates. We don't. I don't know when Noel is going to have you turn something in, you know? I would be able to work around that if I knew, you know, like if we all got together and tried to do that. But I guess that it sort of takes away that academic freedom thing for the faculty. But if I knew that something, you had a big deadline, I would, never mind, I'm all getting all emotional about this. There's lots of things I would like to change about higher ed. And just remember, it's probably not you. School is really hard.
Well, I do also want to say that one of the things about like working so much, you have to be careful of burnout. You have to be careful of your body because you can injure your hand, and then you cannot work as long as you could before. You could wind up having health issues you didn't have before. So do take care of yourself. This is coming from the person who did like 5 hours of sleep normally and 3 was during finals. That's not the healthiest thing. I'm just saying. I had a friend at SCAD. He was a director for like 3 animated shorts during his final year, like his final quarter. He came in one day, he's like, I haven't slept in 3 days.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
It's no good. It's no good. And I remember those feelings too. I mean, being an undergrad, you know, like they were intense days. You know, so I think a huge part of why I think it's stressful too is because you're just kind of figuring out who you are as a person, maybe a little bit, and you're trying to balance your social life, which I think is just as important as your school. And it's really intense, you know. And so I feel y'all.
Well, I stopped here for a second because I need to look up some reference. Because if you want to know, this level of drawing does not happen without reference.
Kiri is an insane artist. Like, you have to check out Kiri Torres.
Yeah, her work is very different than mine.
Yeah.
But her technique is excellent.
It's the technique. Like, just watching Kiri work is insane. Like, and she's also really just like contagious. Like, her happiness is contagious.
Yes.
Like, if you hang out with Kiri for just a few minutes, you will be cured of all your anxiety.
She is a bubble of joy. And so, but I do work, you don't see it on this screen here because I have 2 screens, but I do work with a lot of reference. But I needed to find some skulls, but I want to be careful because half of these are copyrighted and a lot of them are not anatomically correct. So there are ways for you to look for stuff. Typically, if you go to like Wikipedia, sometimes they'll have free for common use stuff. But do look to make sure that it is free to use for commercial use before you reference something, especially if it's a major point in your backgrounds. The other thing that I do a lot of is get my own referencing so that I can also get my own textures. So let's see here. I'm trying to find my here we go. I have a hard drive, an external, that I have full of thousands and thousands of photos, and so I try to look here first to see if I have something and go from there. because I like doing animals a lot, and when I go to the zoo, I get reference. I take photos for reference and such, but what I'm looking for right now is if I had something from a natural history museum, so not sure if I do. We will find out. Oh, I do have something, but I can't show it on screen. It's I went to the this was a while ago, but I went to the Human Bodies Museum. I got some stuff from there. The other thing is that if you are going to use something from, you also have to be careful if you're going to use something from museums and stuff. If you take photos there, they typically also have rules that you need to look up on their website about usage. So
Yeah, and
I know.
some art directors are really particular about usage. I did a piece for the LA Times recently, and I had to like take out I did a piece of Nirvana, and I had to take out the rips in Kurt Cobain's pants because they were taken from a photo of him wearing pants that were ripped for Rolling Stone like some years ago. I kept the rips in my version, but the printed version was different. Like they were really, they even made me take out the chain wallet as well. So what Ober is showing right here is super important. Like having a reference library, it's become so much easier to take reference because people just have their phones, and just take a ton of reference. I think that was the thing that helped me the most with that Dennis Diderot piece that I mentioned earlier, is that there wasn't much reference of him on the internet, right? Which I think is typically where people go. They go to Google to find things. But there was a year in our life where we saw a free ad on Craigslist for all these National Geographic magazines that were being curbed for free. And apparently it was this man's late mother's collection of like her entire life. And we have probably like 1,000+ National Geographic mags that we picked up. And some of them go back to like before the Titanic sank. It's crazy. And you can like smell the difference in the paper quality from then to now. It's just much richer paper quality. And the content in those magazines has saved my life on so many occasions, because you could type in the word hand in Google and you may get a similar result that someone else is getting. Whereas looking in a magazine like that and just seeing all this rich 18th century, 19th century imagery that I wouldn't otherwise encounter via Google's algorithms. And when you're taking reference the way Ober is right here, you're probably not going to find an elephant like that on Google really quickly, because how many people have taken a photo, of an animal the same exact way that Ober's taking them, right?
So there's some things that like I can't get, and I have to do it from online. But I do try to be careful about usage rights. If you change it a lot, that's great. That's the best. But you should also make sure that it is okay for you to use. Adobe does have its own stock thing that if you have the full suite, you can use, but it's limited in terms of what's there. But if you need some basic stuff, like I'll sometimes pull bark from there for textures for the trees and whatnot. So
isn't that something that Rick used to do too? Like I saw Rick Lovell doing like a painting of like I think it was like a dinosaur or something, and I saw him take actual photo like of the texture of the back of an elephant, and he just dropped the photo into his layers and just kept the photo there, like just as the texture of this dinosaur. And I thought that was really impressive.
I do that too. So when I get this closer to done, I'll go ahead and do it for this tree here, since this guy is getting close. But let me pull up, because I've already pulled the the reference for that one.
And
So
at some point, I want to see if you can turn off the layers that you've worked on, so that we can see like what all you've accomplished in just this session.
Yeah. So okay. So
the tree.
let's see here. So I've got my.
I was blown away by that, because I was like, oh man, Rick probably spent like 10 hours painting the texture on that dinosaur. And then he was the one who told me, he's like, no, I just took a photo of an elephant, like the back of an elephant, and I used the texture of the elephant's skin as the dinosaur texture, which is crazy. I never thought of that.
I have tons of reptile because of their skin, and I do have some elephant, but typically they're too far away for my lens, because I have a zoom, but not that much of a zoom.
No,
So
no,
usually-
Rick, you probably got like access to hang out with the elephants or something.
Oh yeah. So I do. So getting textures as well while you're out, just on your phone. Usually when my phone gets full, I'll drop everything onto the computer and I'll just sort it then and put it into these files. So here's these I pulled and put them aside specifically. As you can see, all these say Adobe stock. I got these all from the Adobe files. These are free to use with the program, which I have. So I'm going to go ahead and probably just pull this guy in here. So I'm just going to open it on a new file. Oops, not paint. Heaven forbid. All right, so we got the texture here. So I'm going to hit. I'm on a PC. Do you guys work PC or Mac there?
We generally have the Mac.
Okay, so it's going to be Command A to select all. That's what I'm doing right now. And then I'm going to copy it over. And it's huge. So what I'm going to do now is, first I'm going to resize it so I can see what I'm working with. And usually I'll have to patchwork this in. So first I'm going to start with just a general lay-in, see exactly what it's going to be. I'm going to turn down the opacity just so I can see what's happening. I'm going to transform it by using the hotkey Command T. And then I'm going to right click and put warp. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to try to make it so that it kind of matches the wrapping of.
Oh, we just got a message from Tucker. They'll have to head out pretty soon, but he's thanking you, Jennifer. He's thanking me as well. Yeah,
Thank you.
We're always really happy to host y'all, Tucker, and thank you to the students for sitting in, and we hope that you guys pulled something from this that's useful for y'all.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's been super fun.
All right.
Have a
So.
good weekend, everybody, over at Stewart's Creek. Keep going, Jen.
Bye.
Okay. So I'm going to mess around here because it's dark. I'm most likely going to go with overlay.
Overlay.
But sometimes I go with multiply. Depends on how the situation is. So at this point, I typically look at.
If you want to see my computer, y'all can come up here to look at it, because you may not be able to see on her screen. So I'll put that away here, and you can take a look at this. Just looks better.
So I want a little bit of texture. I'll go ahead and raise the opacity a bit. So I want the texture, but of course it looks like I just slapped a photo in. So what I'm going to do is, I didn't change the color of it. One thing I'm going to do is see if I can get it to match up with the hue and saturation a little bit more, because I liked having a little bit of warmth in there, but that was a little bit too much, so I'm going to decrease the saturation. And these kinds of changes, if I'm really scrubbing here and you can hardly see the changes. They're very minute changes, but for me it's going to be this is where practice and me going in and trying over and over how it's going to look and how I like it to look. So I got it to where I kind of like it, and then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to decrease it just a little bit more, and I'm going to go ahead and take my eraser tool and with a soft pressure brush, and I'm just going to carefully just like soften the edges here, because the edges of the picture are so harsh that I want to get rid of that. And what I would do is that I would command copy and paste up along the entire tree. But we're just going to go a little bit quick because I know you guys are running out of time. So once we have this kind of sort of thing in, I'm also going to, one of the rules about like art to help give focus is that when you go into shadow, you should have less detail in the shadows, so that way with the things that are in the light can really stand out and be more detailed. So I'm just going to go ahead and also reduce the amount of texture here just a bit, so it helps with the turn. So now that I've got that, and I've got just a little bit of this going, it still looks like I copied and smacked something in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take my brush, and this is where one of the Kyle brushes comes into play. Everything comes back in a loop. I take up my palette knife brush. I usually turn it. It's a Kyle's palette knife, and it's directional. But what's really nice is that it kind of looks like bark or rock, depending on how you use it. So I'm just color picking here, and I'm going in, I'm following where the image lights are that I put on top, and just painting it in so that way it looks like I've done a lot of work on texture, but I'm melding it into the artwork so that way it looks more natural. It takes a little bit of work this way, but in the long run, it helps a ton with the look.
Yeah, so, I can already tell that it's going in a positive direction. I mean, there were only a couple times I thought to do this, but I never continued to do it because I just wasn't sure if I could keep control of it, as just the idea of collaging imagery into the final art. The way you're doing it is so subtle. It's and then you're also painting back into it. I don't see that as problematic at all.
So it's more of a tool just to help, because I'm still painting on top. It's not like, oh, I did this thing and then I smashed it and that's it.
Yeah.
That's the big difference. And you gotta use what works, because your time is precious.
Mm-hmm.
So use what's available,
mm-hmm.
and but do it ethically.
Totally, yeah.
Use what's available, but do it ethically. So I continue to render and stuff to make sure that it looked more like tree, but as you can see, it's starting to look more integrated while I'm still having that texture. So if I take this off, you can see the change. It's subtle, but it makes it look like I put in a lot more work than I actually did.
And folks aren't going to spend too much time on that tree anyway with their eyes, you know.
No.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so that's why I may eventually soften this even to where it's a little blurred. So it would depend on how it gets worked up. I would do more of this kind of work also on this back tree here, especially since it's going to have a lot of this light hitting it. And then so it's kind of like the stamping idea that I did here with the trees, with the bushes here, but here I need to still detail the bushes to where they get look more like they're in the image, not just smacked on there.
So we are coming at the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask you a couple of questions for everybody here. Just kind of general questions. What is your advice for folks who are, oh, you know what, you've already answered that question. What are some current projects you're working on? Any personal projects or stuff that we'd be able to see soon?
So this one's hopefully will be done soon. I don't know when the project I'm working on with Bento will come out. I haven't been told the date on that yet.
Okay.
But that will come out probably next year.
Oh wow, so it's a longer release date.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure because of the way that the schedule is. It could be that it's half of the season comes out and then half again. We'll see.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for hanging out with us today, and for showcasing your gorgeous skill when it comes to digital painting and character building and tree building. If you ever need anything from me, you just let me know. I'll do my best. And that's our show for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I hope you learned something new. Happy October 1st, and enjoy your weekends, everybody. Thank you so much, Jen. I'll be in touch with you soon.
Bye.